The sky over the Cimarron territory was the color of a fresh bruise, a sullen purple-gray that promised more rain. The mud in the streets of Harmony Gulch was a thick, greedy thing, sucking at the boots of the living and patiently waiting to claim the dead. For Asher Blackwell, the town's name was a bitter, mocking irony. He had not known a moment of harmony in 20 years. He sat in the corner of the muddy spur saloon, the chair creaking under his weight, his back to the wall. It was a habit born from 1,000 nights in 1,000 similar rooms, a cardinal rule in a life governed by them: always see the door. His face, lean and weathered by sun and wind, was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but nothing could hide the profound weariness in his eyes. They were the color of worn slate, and they held the hollowness of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. Across the room, his men, the Crimson Marauders, were celebrating. They had taken the Union Pacific payroll from an armored stagecoach that morning, a job executed with the brutal, terrifying efficiency that had made their name a legend. 3 guards were dead, along with a driver who had been too slow to raise his hands. Now, the fruits of that bloody labor were piled on the table, canvas bags overflowing with cash, the clink of coins a counterpoint to the raucous laughter and the tinny, out-of-tune piano. Cyrus Thorne, Ash's second-in-command, and the only man he had ever remotely considered a friend, raised a bottle of whiskey. To Ash Blackwell, he roared, his voice a gravelly boom. The devil himself, with a gun in each hand. The others cheered, a ragged chorus of killers and thieves. Ash didn't flinch. He simply took a slow sip of his own whiskey, the cheap liquor burning a familiar path down his throat. The devil. They called him that as a compliment. He felt it as a brand. He could still see the face of the young guard, no older than 20, his eyes wide with terror in the instant before Ash's bullet had taken his life. The boy had been brave. Stupidly, pointlessly brave. And Ash had killed him for it, the motion as thoughtless and automatic as breathing. It was just another ghost to add to the legion that haunted his sleep. "You're quiet, Ash," Cyrus said, swaggering over to his table and dropping into the opposite chair. "That ain't like you. We should be celebrating. This was the biggest score of our lives." "We lost a man," Ash said, his voice a low, flat monotone. Jimmy took a round from the rooftop guard. Cyrus waved a dismissive hand. Jimmy knew the risks. "We all do. He died rich." He leaned forward, his eyes, small and bright like a boar's, glinting with a greedy light. $50,000, Ash. We can buy our way to Mexico, live like kings. There's not enough gold in the world to buy back a life, Cyrus, Ash said, staring into his glass. Cyrus laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Since when did you find a soul, old friend? You're the man who planned the Black Creek massacre. You're the one who faced down Marshal Kane in a fair fight and still put 2 bullets in him while he was on the ground." The marshal was still reaching for a boot knife, Ash corrected, the memory replaying with the cold, detached clarity of all the others. "It was a clean kill." "My point exactly," Cyrus grinned. "You don't do what's right. You do what's necessary. That's why we follow you. That's why your name makes grown men piss their britches. We're a hell of a team." Ash looked up, his slate gray eyes finally meeting Cyrus's. "No," he said, the word hanging in the air with a sudden, heavy finality. "We're not." He pushed his chair back and stood up. He walked over to the table where the money was piled and took one of the smaller bags, barely $1,000. The rest of the gang fell silent, watching him, a new tension in the room. "What's this?" Cyrus asked, his smile gone, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "That's my share," Ash said. "The rest is yours. I'm done." The saloon was so quiet you could hear the rain begin to patter against the windows. The piano player's hands froze over the keys. "Done." Cyrus's voice was dangerously soft now. "What do you mean, done? Men like us don't get to be done, Ash. There's only one way out of this life, and it's in a pine box." "I'm taking another way," Ash said. He turned to face the room, his gaze sweeping over the men he had ridden with, fought with, and bled with. He saw nothing in their faces but a mixture of confusion and greed. They weren't his brothers. They were just wolves in the same pack, and he was tired of the taste of blood. "The name Asher Blackwell is a curse," he said, his voice resonating with a weariness that went bone deep. "It's a wanted poster in every town from here to the Mississippi. It's a noose waiting to be tightened. You can have the money. You can have the reputation. I don't want them anymore." He turned to leave. "You walk out that door, and you're a dead man, ass," Cyrus warned, his chair scraping as he stood. "We'll hunt you down. The law will hunt you down. There's nowhere for you to go." Ash paused at the door, but did not turn around. "Then I'll just have to be someone else." He pushed the swinging doors open and stepped out into the rain and the mud. He heard Cyrus roar in fury behind him, the sound of a table being overturned. He didn't run. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace to his horse, a powerful roan named Ghost. As he swung into the saddle, he heard the saloon doors burst open. He didn't look back. He spurred Ghost into a gallop, and the sounds of Harmony Gulch shouting, the curses, the single, angry gunshot that whizzed past his head were swallowed by the drumming of the rain and the thunder of his horse's hoofs. He rode for 2 days without stopping, pushing himself and his horse to the limits of their endurance. He rode away from his past, away from the blood and the gold and the weight of his own name. He was not just fleeing from Cyrus and the law. He was fleeing from himself. On the 3rd morning, he found what he was looking for, a small, forgotten valley, nestled between 2 high mesas, a place so remote and peaceful it felt like it belonged to a different world. A small creek, clear and cold, ran through it, and the grass was green and lush. It was a place a man could disappear, a place a man could start again. He dismounted, his body aching with a fatigue that was more than just physical. He took the bag of money, the last link to his old life. He found a deep crevice in the rocks and threw it in, the clink of the coins a faint, final echo. He unstrapped his gun belt, the one with the matched set of Schofield revolvers that had made him a legend. He hesitated for a long moment, the worn leather familiar in his hands. This was his identity, his power, his curse. With a final, decisive act, he threw the gun belt into the crevice as well. He kept only one weapon, an old, beat-up Colt Peacemaker he had carried as a boy, tucked into his waistband. He was not a fool. Freedom might be his goal, but survival was a necessity. He stood there for a long time, the clean, rain-washed air filling his lungs. He was a man with no money, no crew, and no name. The fear that had been his constant companion, the fear of a stray bullet, a hangman's noose, was still there. But for the first time, it was joined by something else. Something small and fragile, but fiercely alive. Hope? He got back on his horse, a solitary figure in a vast, empty landscape. His last ride as Asher Blackwell was over. His first ride as a free man, a man in search of a new name and a new life, had just begun. For 6 months, the ghost of Asher Blackwell remained buried. The man who walked in his shoes called himself Abel, a name he'd plucked from a gravestone in a forgotten churchyard on his journey. It was a quiet, unassuming name, a name that tasted of earth and sweat, not gunpowder and blood. He chose the Valley of Redemption for the same reason a wounded animal seeks a hidden den. It was quiet, remote, and overlooked by the world. To the handful of souls who lived there, he was a drifter, his past a vague story of a mining bust and bad luck, a narrative so common it was practically invisible. His hands, which had known only the cold, checkered grips of a Schofield revolver and the slick feel of poker cards, now learned the rough, honest language of wood and leather. He hired on with a grizzled old homesteader named Silas Croft, a man whose back was as unbent as his principles. Croft judged a man by the sweat on his brow, not the shadows in his eyes. Abel had to constantly remind himself of the name-mended fences under a sun that seemed to be trying to bake the sin from his skin. He broke wild horses, the violent, explosive struggle, a familiar dance, but one that ended in a partnership of trust, not a pool of blood. He drove cattle through long, silent days, the lowing of the herd and the cry of the hawk the only sounds. The physical labor was a brutal kind of penance. It left his muscles screaming and his body aching, and at the end of the day, a profound exhaustion settled deep in his bones. It was a gift. The exhaustion was a wall that kept the ghosts at bay. In the small, clean bunkhouse Croft provided, sleep came not as a landscape of terror filled with the wide, accusing eyes of the dead, but as a deep, dreamless black. For the first time in a decade, he slept. Slowly, cautiously, he let the rhythms of this new life seep into him. He learned the names of the townspeople. He listened to their simple concerns, the price of feed, the threat of a coming frost, the health of a newborn calf. It was a foreign language, a dialect of a life he had only ever seen from the outside, through the scope of a rifle or the swinging doors of a saloon. It was on the porch of the general store, a place that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust, that he first spoke to Eliza Gable. He had seen her before, of course. In a town of 50 souls, every face becomes familiar. She was a young widow, her husband taken by a winter fever a few years back, and she ran her small homestead with a quiet, fierce determination that he recognized as a different kind of strength than his own. His was the strength of a cornered predator, hers was the strength of deep-rooted oak, designed to endure. She had kind eyes, the color of warm honey, and they held a sadness that he understood, but none of the coldness that lived in his own. He was buying coffee, and she was beside him, pricing a bolt of blue calico cloth. "That's a fine color," he'd said, the words feeling clumsy and loud in his own ears. He hadn't made small talk with a decent woman in his entire adult life. She had looked up, a small, startled smile touching her lips. "I think so. I'm hoping to make a new dress for the Founders' Day picnic." That first, awkward exchange had been a seed. In the weeks that followed, it grew. He would find reasons to be at the store when he knew she would be there. He asked her advice on planting a small vegetable garden. She asked him about the best way to patch a leaky roof. He found a strange, unfamiliar comfort in these simple conversations. They were real. They were about building and mending, not taking and breaking. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley. He was riding back from the high pasture and saw that a large branch had fallen from a cottonwood tree, crashing through a section of her corral fence. He didn't hesitate. He dismounted and spent the next 2 hours in the driving rain, clearing the heavy limb and mending the fence rails, his hands working with a practiced efficiency. She had come out when the rain stopped, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a look of surprise and gratitude on her face. "You didn't have to do that, Abel. It needed doing," he'd said, unable to meet her gaze, feeling a strange heat on his neck that had nothing to do with the sun. "Well," she said softly, "the least I can do is offer you a piece of pie and a hot cup of coffee." He had sat in her small, clean kitchen, a place that smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. It was the first time he had been inside a real home in 20 years. He watched her move about the room, her actions graceful and sure, and felt a pang of something so sharp and painful he almost mistook it for a wound. It was longing. A longing for a life that he had always believed was a fantasy, something for other men, not for him. As he ate the best thing he had ever tasted, listened as she spoke of her late husband, of their dream to build a life in this valley. She spoke of him with love, but without the crippling weight of grief. She had mourned, and she had endured. "It gets lonely, sometimes," she confessed, her gaze directed out the window at the land she worked so hard to keep. "But it's a good life. A quiet life." He looked at her then, at the strength in her face, at the kindness in her eyes, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he allowed himself to imagine a future. He saw more mornings, more pies, more quiet conversations. He saw a life where the name Abel was not a disguise, but simply who he was. The thought was so powerful, so filled with a fragile, dangerous hope, that it scared him more than any lawman's gun. The weight of his real name, Asher Blackwell, felt heavier than ever, a millstone threatening to drag him down and drown him in the quiet, peaceful waters of this life he was beginning to crave. He was a wolf pretending to be a sheepdog, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the flock was in more danger than it could ever imagine. The past is a patient hunter. It does not tire, it does not sleep, and it does not forget. Ash had lived with this knowledge for so long it had become a part of his bones. He knew his fragile peace was a house built on sand, and he was constantly watching the horizon for the inevitable tide. The tide arrived on a hot, dusty Tuesday, in the form of a lanky, weasel-faced man named Slim Finn. Ash spotted him from the high pasture where he was branding calves. The rider was a long way off, just a speck on the valley road, but Ash's eyes, trained by years of scanning for threats, picked out the details. The horse was unfamiliar, its gait the tired plod of a long journey. The rider slouched in his saddle with the lazy arrogance of a man who makes his living with a gun, not a shovel. Ash didn't recognize him at first, but a cold, familiar dread began to pool in his gut. Strangers were rare in redemption, and this one felt wrong. He finished his work, the hot iron searing the Croft brand into hide, the smell of burnt hair acrid in the air. He rode back to town, his posture casual, but every nerve was alight. He saw the horse tied outside the general store. And then he saw the man, leaning against a post on the porch, a rolled-up piece of paper in his hand. Ash got closer, and his blood ran cold. It was a wanted poster. And the face on it, a crude but recognizable sketch, was his own. He recognized the man then. Slim Finn. He was not one of the Corps marauders, just a low-level thug, a camp follower who had ridden with them for a few months a year ago. He was a scavenger, a man who survived on the scraps left by more dangerous predators. And Cyrus, in his frustration, must have sent out his jackals to sniff for a trail. Ash knew he had to act, and act fast. He couldn't let Finn show that poster to anyone. He couldn't let the name Asher Blackwell be spoken in this town. He spent the rest of the afternoon watching from a distance, his mind a cold, calculating machine, the old, familiar part of him taking over. He watched Finn go into the saloon. He watched him drink, his eyes scanning the faces of the local men, trying to gauge the town's temperament. Night fell. Ash waited until the town was asleep, the only lights coming from the saloon. He didn't go home to the bunkhouse. He went to the livery stable at the edge of town, a place that smelled of hay and horses. This was where Finn would have left his mount. Ash slipped inside, a shadow in the darkness. He found Finn's horse, and with a few deft movements of his knife, he loosened the cinch strap on the saddle, just enough to hold for a while, but not enough to survive a hard gallop. He then frayed the edge of one of the reins, weakening it. He wasn't planning to kill the man, but he was planning to make sure his escape would be short-lived. He then went to the saloon. He didn't go in the front door. He circled around back, to the small room where the saloon owner let drifters sleep for a few bits. He saw Finn stumble in, drunk and unsuccessful, and collapse onto a cot. Ash waited for a full hour, until the man's breathing was the deep, ragged snore of a drunken sleep. He entered the room as silently as a puff of smoke. He was on Finn before the man could even register he was awake. Ash's hand clamped over his mouth, stifling his shout of alarm. The point of his old Colt peacemaker pressed hard under Finn's chin. "You've gotten lost," Slim Ash whispered, his voice a low, chilling rasp that was pure Asher Blackwell. Finn's eyes were wide with terror in the moonlight filtering through the grimy window. Recognition dawned, followed by disbelief, then pure, abject fear. He was staring at a dead man. "Blackwell," he stammered, the name muffled by Ash's hand. "That name is buried," Ash said, pressing the gun harder. "And anyone who digs it up is going to get buried right alongside it." "Who sent you?" "Cyrus," Finn squeaked, his body trembling. "He's been looking for you. He thinks you cheated him. Thinks you got a bigger score hidden somewhere. He sent us all out, looking for any rumor, any sign." "So you came here," Ash said, "and you found a ghost. Now you're going to disappear. You're going to get on your horse, and you're going to ride out of this valley. You're not going to look back. And you're going to forget everything you saw. You're going to tell Cyrus the trail went cold. Do you understand me?" Finn nodded frantically. "I need to be sure you understand," Ash said, his voice dropping even lower. He described in cold, methodical, and anatomically precise detail exactly what he would do to Finn if he ever saw his face again, or if he heard so much as a whisper of the name Blackwell coming from this direction. He described it with the detached expertise of a butcher, a litany of horrors that made the blood drain from Finn's face. He let him go. Finn scrambled from the cot, his hands shaking. He fumbled to pull his boots on. Ash stood by the door, a silent, menacing shadow. He took the wanted poster from Finn's coat and tucked it into his own. He also took his gun. "Walk," Ash commanded. Finn stumbled out into the night and made for the livery. Ash watched him go. He heard the horse being led out, the frantic creak of saddle leather. He heard the man gallop out of town as if the devil himself were on his heels. Ash waited, counting the seconds. He knew Finn would ride hard, pushing the horse in his panic. A minute passed. Then, from the darkness of the valley road, he heard what he was waiting for, the terrified scream of a horse, the snap of leather, and the heavy, sickening thud of a man hitting the ground at full speed. He had bought himself some time. A man on foot in the wilderness was a slow-moving messenger. But Ash was not a fool. The whisper was out. It might be delayed, it might be garbled, but it was on the wind. And he knew two men who were experts at listening to the wind, Cyrus Thorne and a U.S. Marshal named Gideon Rourke. His peaceful life as Abel was over. He was now just a man living on borrowed time. Marshal Gideon Rourke was a man carved from the same hard and forgiving granite as the mountains he patrolled. He operated onto principles, the absolute, unbending authority of the law, and the unshakable belief that no man was beyond its reach. For 5 years, the name Asher Blackwell had been an affront to both of those principles. Blackwell was more than a criminal. He was a force of chaos, a specter who moved through the territory leaving a trail of bodies and broken safes, always seeming to vanish before the law could close in. The hunt for Blackwell had become Rourke's personal crusade, a test of his will against the outlaw's cunning. He found Slim Finn 2 days after Ash had sent him packing. A posse from a neighboring county had picked him up, a delirious, half-starved man raving about ghosts and the devil himself. Most dismissed him as a drunken fool. But Rourke, who had made a career of sifting for truth in the ramblings of criminals, listened. When he heard the description of the man's impossible speed, the cold, dead eyes, the specific, terrifying threats, a familiar chill of recognition went down his spine. It was Blackwell's signature. The ghost had a location. Rourke did not ride into redemption like a thunderclap. That was not his way. A storm gives warning. Rourke preferred the quiet, unnerving pressure of a coming winter. He arrived alone, on a steel gray horse that seemed as tireless and implacable as its rider. He introduced himself to the town's de facto mayor, the general store owner, as a marshal on the trail of a dangerous fugitive, his inquiries polite, his tone conversational. But his eyes, a piercing, pale blue, missed nothing. He met Abel on his second day. Croft had introduced them. "This here is Abel, marshal. Best hand I've ever had. Quiet man, but works harder than any two I've known." Rourke shook Ash's hand. The grip was firm, the man's hand calloused and hard. He looked like a ranch hand. But his eyes, Rourke was a student of eyes. He had seen the fear in a liar's eyes, the hate in a killer's, the desperation in a hunted man's. The eyes of this Abel were different. They were unnervingly calm, disciplined. They were the eyes of a man who was constantly assessing, constantly watching. They were the eyes of a wolf who had taught himself to look like a sheep. The Cold War began. Rourke did not make an accusation. He simply stayed. He took a room at the boarding house. He spent his days observing, his presence a constant, silent question mark hanging over the town. He would watch Abel from the porch of the general store, his gaze unwavering. He would ask casual questions to the townspeople about the quiet ranch hand. Where did he come from? Did he have family? Ash felt the pressure like a physical weight. He knew exactly who Rourke was. The man's reputation was as legendary on one side of the law as Ash's was on the other. Every day was a performance. He had to force himself to move slower, to not constantly scan the rooftops, to keep his back to a door without his skin crawling. Every interaction with Rourke was a high-stakes poker game. Ash had to play the part of Abel, a simple man unnerved by the presence of a powerful lawman, while the ghost of Asher Blackwell was screaming at him to run, to fight, to put a bullet in the marshal and disappear. Eliza was caught in the invisible crossfire. She saw the change in Abel. The quiet peace that had been slowly growing in him was replaced by a deep, cold tension. She saw the way Marshal Rourke watched him, his gaze not just observant, but predatory. Her protective instincts, born from a deep and growing affection for the kind, haunted man, were roused. "That marshal," she said to Abel one evening as they shared a coffee on her porch. "He seems to have taken a special interest in you." "Lawmen are suspicious by nature," Ash said, forcing a casualness he did not feel. "It's their job." "It feels like more than that," she insisted, her brow furrowed with concern. "The way he looks at you, it's like he's trying to see right through you." He couldn't answer. He could only look at her, at the open, honest concern on her face, and feel the chasm between his two lives grow ever wider. The shadow of the law had fallen over his small patch of sunlight, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that the darkness that followed would be absolute. Rourke was waiting for a single mistake, a single crack in the fouade. And Ash knew, with Cyrus's jackals sniffing at his trail, that the mistake was not a matter of if, but when. The storm broke on a Sunday. Ash was helping Eliza nail a new shingle to her roof when he heard its distant, rhythmic thunder of a dozen shod hooves moving at a gallop. a sound that bypassed his ears and went straight to the primal, survival part of his brain. It was a sound he had made himself 100 times. It was the sound of an attack. He looked out from the roof, and his blood turned to ice. Cresting the hill at the edge of the valley were 7 riders. They were not lawmen. They were not drifters. At their head, on a big, black gelding, was the unmistakable figure of Cyrus Thorne. The whisper had finally reached its destination. His past had arrived, and it had come for him. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Get inside. Bar the door. Get the shotgun and stay away from the windows." "Abel, what is it?" she asked, her face pale with alarm. "No time," he said, scrambling down the ladder. "Just do it." He didn't have his guns. His old Colt was in his saddlebag at the Croft Ranch, a mile away. He was exposed, armed with nothing but a hammer. The Crimson Marauders did not slow down. They rode into redemption not like men, but like a force of nature, a wave of violence meant to shatter the town's peace. They fanned out, their rifles and pistols drawn. 2 of them went straight for the general store, kicking in the door. 2 more took the blacksmith shop. Cyrus and the other 3 rode directly for Ash, reining in their horses in a circle around him, their faces a mixture of triumph and murderous intent. "Well, well," Cyrus sneered, his boar's eyes sweeping over Ash's work clothes, the hammer in his hand. "Look what we have here." The ghost of Asher Blackwell, playing farmer, he spat on the ground. "This is your new life, Ash. Mending roofs for widows. It's pathetic." The town was in shock. People peered from their windows, their faces filled with terror. Marshal Rourke emerged from the boarding house, his hand on his gun, but he froze when he saw the number of men, their rifles trained on the town's inhabitants. He was outgunned. "It's over, Cyrus," Ash said, his voice calm, his mind racing, trying to find a way out of a trap that had no exit. "Over," Cyrus laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's just getting started. We had a deal, Ash. Partners. But you ran out. And you didn't take your share of the union job. A man like you doesn't leave $50,000 on the table unless he's got $1 million hidden somewhere else. You're going to give us your secret stash, Ash. The score you've been sitting on all these years." It was a mad delusion, born from Cyrus's own greed and paranoia. Ash had no secret stash. His only treasure was the piece he had found here. The door to Eliza's cabin opened. She stood there, her face white, a double-barreled shotgun held in her trembling hands. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice shaking but firm. Cyrus's grin widened. "Well, now. The little widow has claws." In a blur of motion, he spurred his horse forward, leaning down and grabbing Eliza, pulling her from the doorway and onto the horse in front of him. He pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol to her head. "This changes the terms," he snarled at Ash. "You're going to tell me where the money is. And she's going to be your motivation. You've got until sunrise. Then I start taking this town apart, piece by piece, starting with her." Ash stood there, helpless. The life he had built, the woman he had begun to love, the very soul he had tried to reclaim, all of it was now a hostage to the monster he had helped create. He looked at Eliza's terrified face, and then at the triumphant, hateful sneer of Cyrus Thorne. The last ride of Asher Blackwell had led him here, to a final, bloody reckoning in the one place on earth he had dared to call home. Redemption was about to be bought with blood. The world narrowed to the single, horrific tableau in the middle of the street, Cyrus, the monster of Ash's own making, holding a gun to Eliza's head. The townsfolk were frozen in terror. Marshal Rourke stood by the boarding house, a statue of impotent fury, his hand on his holstered pistol, unable to risk a shot. Ash stood alone, unarmed, stripped bare of his disguise, the ghosts of his past and present colliding in a single, catastrophic moment. Cyrus and his men herded their hostages, including Eliza, into the general store. It was the most defensible building in town, with thick adobe walls and a clear view of the street. "Sunrise, Ash," Cyrus roared from the doorway, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "My money, or her life." The door slammed shut, the sound like a coffin lid closing. For a long moment, Ash didn't move. He was adrift in a sea of failure. His desperate grab for a new life had not only failed, it had brought the wolves down upon the sheep he had come to care for. He felt a familiar, cold despair begin to settle over him, the nihilistic whisper that had been his companion for years, telling him that this was his fate, that men like him only ever brought ruin. Then he saw her face again in his mind's eye, Alice's terror, but also the flicker of defiance in her eyes as she'd held the shotgun. He thought of the quiet dignity of the townspeople, of Silas Croft's gruff kindness. These people had accepted him as able. They had shown him a life he thought was impossible. He could not let his past be the thing that destroyed their future. The despair receded, replaced by the cold, hard resolve of Asher Blackwell. He was a killer. He was a strategist. And he would unleash every dark skill he possessed to save this town. But he was one man. As if summoned by the thought, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the boarding house porch. Marshal Gideon Rourke walked towards him, his boots making a slow, deliberate crunch in the dusty street. His face was grim, his blue eyes holding a complex mixture of fury and calculation. "This is your mess, Blackwell," Rourke said, his voice a low, hard rasp. He stopped 10 feet away, his hand still resting on the butt of his Colt. "I'm aware of that," Ash replied, his voice flat. "They've got a dozen hostages. At least 5 men with rifles. Any direct assault is a death sentence for everyone in that store," Rourke stated, his mind already working the tactical problem. "I know," Ash said. He finally looked at the marshal, his slate gray eyes holding no fear, only a bleak, tired certainty. "I'm going in alone." Rourke's eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch. "Suicide. It's my debt to pay," Ash said. "My ghosts. I brought them here. I'll be the one to send them back to hell. You just get the townspeople to safety." Rourke studied him for a long moment, the lawman in him warring with the pragmatist. He had hunted this man for 5 years, dreamed of the moment he would clap him in irons. But he was also a man sworn to protect the innocent. He had just seen Ash stand ready to die for these people. And he knew, with a professional certainty, that Ash was the only person alive who knew how Cyrus Thorne thought, how he would act, how he could be beaten. "No," the marshal said, the word sharp and decisive. It was not the answer Ash expected. "You're right," Rourke continued. "They're your ghosts. Which means you're the best weapon we have to exorcist them. You and I are going to get those people out. We are going to end this. Together." It was a preposterous idea. The most wanted outlaw in the territory and the U.S. Marshal who had devoted his life to catching him, working as partners. An alliance of ghosts. "And what happens after?" Ash asked, his voice laced with a bitter irony. "After," Rourke said, his blue eyes as hard as chips of ice, "after we get every last one of those people out of there alive, you and I still have a reckoning. I still have a warrant for your arrest. I'm still going to take you in. But first, we save the town." Ash looked at the marshal, at the unbending line of his jaw. He saw no deception, only a fierce, pragmatic devotion to his duty. It was a devil's bargain. His freedom, which had already been a phantom, in exchange for Liz's life. There was no choice. There never had been. "All right, Marshal," Ash said, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips. "You've got a partner." He turned and began to walk towards the Croft homestead. "Where are you going?" Rourke demanded. "I'm going to get my guns," Ash replied, without looking back. "And then you and I are going to go to war." The battle for redemption was fought in the shadows, a deadly chess match played in the alleys and on the rooftops. Ash retrieved his old Colt from his saddlebag, but he knew it wasn't enough. At the Croft homestead, he went to a place Silas had shown him once, a locked shed where the old man kept his past. Croft, in his youth, had been a buffalo hunter and an army scout. The shed held 2 well-oiled Winchester repeaters and a Henry rifle, along with boxes of ammunition. The old man, his face grim but resolute, handed them over. "Go give him hell, son," he said, calling Ash by the name he still believed was his. Back in town, Ash and Rourke laid out their plan in the darkness of the blacksmith's forge. Ash was the strategist, his mind, once used to planning robberies, now working to dismantle one. "Cyrus is arrogant," he explained, sketching a map of the town in the dirt. "He'll post 2 men on the roof of the store. Best vantage point. One watching the front, one the back. He'll keep 1 man on the hostages, probably his most nervous gun, a kid named Jesse. Cyrus and his top man, a brute named Cole, will be covering the main floor. 5 men," Rourke calculated. 2 of us. "Not 2," Ash corrected. He looked at Silas Croft and the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, who had joined them. But we don't fight them head-on. We bleed them. We make them feel like they're surrounded by an army of ghosts. The attack began not with a bang, but with a whisper. Ash, moving with a silence that was terrifying to behold, scaled the wall at the back of the general store. The rooftop guard was watching the alley, his rifle held loosely, his attention wandering. He never heard Ash coming. Ash didn't use a gun. A single, precise blow with the butt of his pistol, and the guard slumped to the roof, unconscious. Ash took his rifle and ammunition. One down. Rourke, meanwhile, had taken the blacksmith and Croft to the opposite end of the street, positioning them in the hayloft of the livery stable. On Ash's signal the hoot of an owl, a sound he could mimic perfectly the open fire. Not at the store, but at the windows of the saloon across the street. The volley of shots, coming from an unexpected direction, shattered the glass and sent splinters of wood flying. The effect was immediate. The marauders, thinking they were under a full-scale assault, returned fire wildly at the saloon, wasting ammunition on a phantom enemy. In the midst of this chaos, Ash, now on the roof, moved to the front. The second guard was peering over the edge, trying to get a bead on the shooters in the stable. Ash took him out with the same silent efficiency as the first. To down. The true genius of the plan was psychological. Ash and Rourke's small team began a pattern of coordinated fire from multiple locations. A shot from the livery, followed seconds later by a shot from the roof of the boarding house, then another from the alley behind the church. It created the illusion of a much larger force, tightening a noose around the store. Inside, panic was setting in. Cyrus roared at his men, his arrogance cracking. He couldn't see his enemy. He felt like he was fighting shadows. He was being outthought, outmaneuvered. The moment came when Cyrus, in a fit of rage, sent Cole out the back door to try and flank the attackers. It was the mistake Ash had been waiting for. Rourke, hidden in the shadows of the blacksmith's forge, was waiting. The confrontation was short and brutal. Rourke was a lawman, not a killer, but Cole was a charging bull. Rourke's shot was precise, hitting Cole in the leg, sending him down in a cursing heap. 3 down. Now the time was right for the main assault. While Rourke and the others laid down a heavy covering fire on the front of the store, Ash dropped from the roof into the back alley. He kicked in the back door. The kid, Jesse, was there, guarding the terrified hostages, including Eliza. He spun around, his pistol wavering. He was out of his depth, his face a mask of pure terror. Ash didn't raise his gun. "It's over, kid," he said, his voice calm. "You can walk out of here, or you can die here. Your choice." The kid looked at Ash's cold, steady eyes, then at the terrified faces of the hostages. He dropped his gun sobbing. Ash herded the hostages out the back door, sending them running towards the safety of the church. He saw Liz's face for a brief moment. He saw fear, confusion, but also a glimmer of something else, a dawning understanding. He turned back into the store. Now, only Cyrus remained. The final debt was about to be paid. The general store was a wreck, its shelves overturned, the floor littered with broken glass and spent cartridges. Cyrus Thorne stood in the middle of it all, a king in a ruined castle, his face a mask of feral fury. He had been beaten. His gang was gone, his plan was in ashes. But he still had one card left to play. He grabbed Eliza as she was nearing the door, pulling her back and holding her as a human shield, the muzzle of his pistol pressed hard against her temple. "Ass," he bellowed, his voice raw with hate. "It's you and me. Like it always should have been." Ash stepped out from behind a row of shelves, his hands held empty at his sides. Rourke appeared in the front doorway at the same time, his own gun leveled. "Let her go, Thorne," the marshal commanded. "It's over." "It's not over till he's dead," Cyrus snarled, his eyes fixed on Ash. "This is your fault. All of it. We were kings. You had it all, and you threw it away. For what? For this. For a plot of dirt and a farmer's widow." "I threw it away because I was tired of the blood, Cyrus," Ash said, his voice quiet, weary. "I was tired of becoming you." "You were always me," Cyrus spat. "You just hid it better." The great Asher Blackwell, with his plans and his code. "There's no code out here, Ash. Only taking what you want. I wanted gold. You wanted peace. We're just thieves of a different stripe." He was trying to get a rise out of Ash, to make him reckless. But Ash remained calm, his gaze locked on Eliz's face, trying to convey a reassurance he did not feel. "There's no phantom stash of gold, is there?" Cyrus asked, a mad light in his eyes. "You really did just walk away." "I did," Ash confirmed. Cyrus let out a bark of laughter, a sound completely unhinged. "Then you really are a fool. And you're going to die for it." He began to back towards the rear of the store, dragging Eliza with him. Ash and Rourke followed, their guns up, the tension stretched to a breaking point. The moment of truth came from an unexpected source. A single ray of afternoon sun lanced through a bullet hole in the wall, hitting a shard of broken mirror on the floor and reflecting a brilliant, blinding flash of light directly into Cyrus's eyes. He flinched, his head jerking back for a fraction of a second. It was the opening Ash had been praying for. "Now, Eliza," he yelled. Eliza, who had been waiting for any chance, didn't hesitate. She drove her elbow back, hard, into Cyrus's ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening almost imperceptibly. But it was enough. She dropped, twisting away from him. In that same instant, both Ash and Cyrus fired. The store was filled with the deafening roar of the two gunshots. Cyrus, firing blindly in a rage, sent his bullet wide, smashing into a barrel of flour. Ash's shot, born of a lifetime of deadly practice, did not miss. It struck Cyrus square in the chest. The big man staggered back, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He looked down at the blossoming red stain on his shirt, then back up at Ash. He opened his mouth to say something, but only a bloody gurgle came out. He collapsed, his reign of terror finally over. Ash stood there, the smoke curling from his pistol. He had killed the man who was once his closest friend. But as he looked at Cyrus's body, he felt no triumph, only a profound, aching sorrow. Then a burning pain erupted in his side. He looked down. A dark stain was spreading across his own shirt. In the exchange, one of Cyrus's men, wounded but not dead, had fired a final, stray shot from the floor. Ash staggered, clutching his side, and fell to one knee, the world beginning to gray at the edges. The aftermath of the battle was a strange, muted silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the soft weeping of the freed hostages. The townspeople emerged from their hiding places, their faces a mixture of shock, grief, and overwhelming relief. They saw the dead marauders. They saw Cyrus Thorne's body being dragged from the store. And they saw Ash, their Abel, leaning heavily against a porch post, his face pale, his shirt soaked with blood, Marshal Rourke standing over him like a sentinel. The lawman was facing the dilemma of his career. Asher Blackwell, the man he had devoted 5 years to hunting, was his prisoner. He was wounded, disarmed, and surrounded. His duty was clear and absolute: put the man in irons, get him to a doctor, and then transport him to the nearest federal court to stand trial. A trial that would have only one possible outcome: the gallows. But as he looked around, he saw something that wasn't in any law book. He saw the faces of the townspeople. They weren't looking at Ash with fear or revulsion. They were looking at him with a fierce, protective gratitude. Silas Croft stood with his rifle, not pointing it at Ash, but standing as if to guard him. The blacksmith, Gus, did the same. Eliza was the one who walked forward, her face streaked with tears and dust, but her eyes clear and resolute. She stood directly in front of the marshal, blocking his path to Ash. "His name is Abel," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "He's a good man. He saved us. He saved this town." "Ma'am," Rourke said, his voice gentle but firm, "I appreciate what he did. But the law is the law. That man is Asher Blackwell. He's wanted for robbery and murder in 3 territories. The man you were hunting is not the man who lives here," Eliza insisted, her voice rising with passion. "I don't know who Asher Blackwell was, but I know Abel. I know the man who patched my roof and helped my neighbors. I know the man who just risked his life or was dying for all of us. Does that count for nothing?" Rourke looked from her impassioned face to Ash. Ash met his gaze, his expression resigned. He expected no mercy. He had made his choices long ago. He was ready to pay the price. Rourke had spent his life in a world of black and white, of guilt and innocence, of law and chaos. But this valley, this town, this man, they were a shade of gray he had never encountered. He had pursued a legend, a monster. But in the forge of battle, he had fought alongside a man who had chosen, at the highest possible cost, to be a hero. He had seen the truth. He thought of his official report. He could write that Asher Blackwell had resisted arrest and had been killed in the ensuing firefight along with the rest of his gang. It would be a lie. But would it be an injustice? What purpose would be served by hanging a man who had, in the end, given everything to protect the innocent? His choice was not between duty and mercy. It was between the letter of the law and its spirit. He made his decision. Marshal Gideon Rourke's official report was a model of concise, factual storytelling. It detailed the heroic defense of the town of Redemption by its citizens, aided by a U.S. Marshal, against the notorious Crimson Marauders. It concluded by stating that the gang's leader, Asher Blackwell, had been killed in the final exchange of gunfire, his body buried in an unmarked grave along with the rest of his crew. The case, which had consumed 5 years of his life, was officially closed. He gave Ash one night. He stood guard outside Eliz's cabin, not as a jailer, but as a protector, while she cleaned and stitched Ash's wound. The bullet had gone clean through, missing anything vital. It was a serious wound, but with care, it would heal. Their time together was filled with the heavy weight of unspoken things. The truth was now between them, a chasm that could not be crossed. She knew who he was, and he knew that the peaceful life he had dreamed of with her was an impossibility. To stay would be to put her in constant danger, to chain her to a man who would always be looking over his shoulder. "You should have told me," she whispered as she tied the last bandage. "I couldn't," he said, his voice hoarse. "Abel was the man I wanted to be. Asher is the man I am. I couldn't bring his ghost into your home." "The man I saw today," she said, her eyes meeting his, he was both. Before sunrise, Rourke brought him a horse. He handed Ash a canteen and a small bag of supplies. "The official story is you're dead," the marshal said, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. "That buys you a new life. Don't waste it. The man I was hunting died yesterday. I don't ever want to hear his name again." Ash looked at the marshal, the man who had been his nemesis, and saw not an enemy, but the likely agent of his salvation. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. He turned to Eliza, who stood on her porch, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. There were no grand declarations, no tearful goodbyes. Their farewell was in a long, shared look, a look of gratitude, of sorrow, of what might have been. It was the hardest ride of his life. He mounted the horse, his side a blaze of fire. He was no longer Asher Blackwell, the feared outlaw. He was not Abel, the quiet homesteader. He was just a man, stripped of everything but a future he had not earned, but had been given. He rode north, not looking back, the rising sun at his back. His last ride was not a blaze of glory, not a flight from justice. It was a quiet, solitary journey into the unknown. He had ridden into redemption seeking a place to hide, and in the end, had found the one thing he thought was lost forever, to chance. The name that had struck fear was finally just a story, and the man who had worn it was finally free.